they are. So very much appreciated. The next question comes via video from Uwin Utu in Nigeria, and he's from the African Youth Movement.
My name is Robert Utu, and I work with the African Youth Movement as an advisor. Your Excellency, in what ways do you intend to assist poorer communities to deal with climate and energy emergencies in the face of the current war in Ukraine? Thank you.
Very timely question. We'll take one more before moving, although we don't have one set up. So I'm going to ask you maybe to address that question immediately, and then we're going to open up the floor.
Thank you much, and many thanks to Uwem for this question, which brings us right to this day. But let us also try to separate some issues, because he mentioned climate and energy emergencies related to the war in Ukraine. Let's be honest to ourselves. While the war on Ukraine and war in Ukraine is the most horrible thing we have today, in terms of political relationship, in terms of international security, and this cannot be accepted. It is against the Charter of the United Nations, against international law, and against all what we envisage as the future for all of us. But when it comes to climate change, the climate emergency did not start with the war in Ukraine. It started much, much earlier. Actually, it started 200 years ago, when we ignited the Industrial Revolution, and it speeded up in the last 20 years. The war in Ukraine does not have a direct implication of the climate emergency, but still it is one of the major issues, the climate emergency, we have to address. What the Ukrainian war triggered, actually, is the food crisis. And in many parts of the world, the energy crisis. Food crisis, because you may know that Ukraine and Russia are supplying about quarter, a little bit more than quarter, of the world grain supplies and some of the cooking oil supplies, a significant part. In the case of some countries, their proportion in their imports is over 80%. In the case of the UN humanitarian activities, more than 90% of the grain supplied to vulnerable communities came from Ukrainian and Russian producers. So when the war broke out, these supplies actually were ended, at least temporarily. So what happened, the world markets reacted in a very nervous manner and sent prices to the skies, putting some of the most vulnerable nations in a very, very difficult situations. First and foremost, not all of them were able and capable of paying for higher prices on wheat. It's a food emergency, it's a social emergency, and it's a political emergency in a country. The second, even in those countries where governments, companies, customers were able to pay for higher prices, in certain cases, there was no commodities available on the market for weeks. What do you do if you are a government when there are no supplies and you know that you will run out of food supplies and you cannot provide it from internal sources? It's a real crisis. So that's why the Secretary General and the UN agencies took this task as the most urgent task the UN system can do to make sure that those supplies, wheat, cooking oil, that are now stuck in the reserves in Ukraine and Russia should find their way in a controlled manner to the global markets. They were very painful negotiations, but the SG succeeded, and I would like to congratulate him and his colleagues once again. They succeeded first for 90 days, and then in a couple of days back, it has been extended for another half a year. What does it mean? That 1.2 billion people who were affected by the food-related impacts of the Ukrainian war on Ukraine, are now receiving a kind of relief. It is not the final solution. The final solution to end the war. There is another aspect of these consequences, because if we work on how to make sure that the supplies can hit the markets, we can address the immediate challenges of famine in a number of countries. But these two countries, including Belarus as a third country, and I would even say Russia and Belarus first and foremost, are major suppliers of fertilizers to the global markets. Those fertilizers are missing now from the global market. What happens if the fertilizers could not hit the market in a very, very near future? It means in the next season, next harvesting season, in many parts of the world, the harvest will be 30% less. So if you reduce the grain supplies by 30%, it's a disaster. It's not let's eat a little bit less bread, it's a disaster. So the other huge efforts concentrated by the SG, Secretary General, and his staff is to make sure that despite the sanctions, despite the exclusion of Russia from the SWIFT system, despite the difficulties of how to secure shipping capacities, how to secure insurances for the supplies, to make sure that the fertilizers and ammonia from those countries could reach the global markets. For the safety and security and for the stability of many, many communities across the globe. And once again, many thanks for him and his all colleagues, including colleagues in Turkey, who were very instrumental in the negotiations. But still, the issue is not fully addressed, because we have an energy crisis as well. It's a very strange war. Very strange war in many, many cases. This war should have never happened. This war has no acceptable reason. But this war is being conducted not only in the battlefields, not only on the level of civilian infrastructure, which is targeted on a daily basis, but in the field of economic relations as well. So we have a set of sanctions, counter-sanctions, difficulties of supplying energies here and there. As a result, we had much less traditional fossil fuel supplies to the markets. What is the consequence? You may say that, hooray, we'll speed up our green transition. Yes, on the long run, I agree. It will be one of the consequences. It will speed up investments into the green technologies. But that takes time. But takes years, in some cases, decades. to develop and implement. And for you, for your communities, and for all countries who are buying energy sources from the world market, the big issue now, how to survive the next 2 weeks, next 2 months, this winter and the next winter. Because within 12 months, we are not going to solve the energy transition in the world. It will take much more time. So there are two negative effects, and let us not hide from ourselves. First, there is an energy crisis in terms of prices. It will impact all of us. It is impacting already all of us. There are many families and many communities in the world who will have to take very painful decisions because of this war, whether or not to buy food or to heat the room. The other effect is that reacting on the emergency situation, many countries started going back to more traditional fossil fuels to make sure that we are not going to get frozen. Going back to coal is basically against what we wanted, against what we agreed upon, because coal is 3 times more polluting than gas, and 20 times more polluting than any technology related to photovoltaic or hydro. So most of our countries, temporarily, we still don't know for how long, started going back to using coal. What is the consequence of that? I'm afraid this year, the greenhouse gas emission, instead of declining 5 to 6%, which would be very much needed for the 1.5 Celsius, will increase. So we're tracking back on our sustainability transformation goals. Still, if we keep the goals, and we have to, it means that those increases today and this year, maybe the next year, will have to be somehow compensated in the years after. A much steadier, much more rapid decrease of the emissions. But let's be quite honest, and speaking in realistic terms, and take the scientific evidence. In order to keep the global temperature rise under 1.5 Celsius, we need a decrease of emissions annually about 6%. Do you know when did it happen? It happened during the COVID, when our economies were basically frozen, when we blocked much of our economic activities. And that rate of decrease should be continued for about 20 years. We are not going to block our economies for 20 years. Instead, now we are increasing our emissions. So it's a very bad trade. Because of the war, we're going to pay a price in energies, higher energies. We're going to pay a price in social tensions, and we are going to pay a price in terms of climate change, which will cause us much more challenges in the medium and further down on the road future. Should we then give it up? No. There are 2 ways. First and foremost, I think, and I cannot repeat enough, this war must be stopped. This war has no place in today's world. Aggression, annexation of territories, bombarding civilian infrastructure has no legitimate ground in the 21st century. The second, we must do our best to get away from the fossil fuels, fossil energies, as much as we can. We need to invest more in those technologies, and we have to make sure that communities must have an access to those technologies, even in cases if the grids are still not built everywhere. We need to think about local supplies, local energy supplies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for detailing the complexities of the fallout all around the world, the ripple effects of this horrific war on everybody, but in particular, those who are already the most vulnerable. I think we all saw how interdependent our world is in other dimensions that we never thought of. I think in particular, the supply of grain and the supply of fertilizer and where it comes from. So thank you for outlining that. And now let's open